Hello and welcome to The Briefing, with me, Tom Harwood, fresh from standing outside Downing Street all day yesterday, playing the guessing game of what was going on behind that door and occasionally shouting at the ministers as they walked down the street. Well, the reshuffle is not over despite the top posts being filled. As you learned yesterday on The Briefing, before all the other broadcasters, today is the day Boris planned to shuffle his junior ministerial ranks. We'll be hearing more about that throughout the day. He got a head start late last night with a handful of appointments, but today is when the backbench Tories will be clutching at their phones and we'll start to see fresh new names climb the ranks. Looking back to yesterday, there were some very clear winners. Liz Truss is now the Foreign Secretary. Nadine Dorries is now the Culture Secretary. Nadeem Zwahi is now the Education Secretary, and Michael Gove has moved to a souped-up version of the Housing Ministry with communities, local government, levelling up and responsibility for union policy. Anne-Marie Trevelyan back in Cabinet as the Trade Secretary, and Simon Clarke back from the backbenches to become Chief Secretary to the Treasury. And to recap on those who lost out yesterday, Dominic Raab demoted from the Foreign Office to the Justice Department. Amanda Milling demoted from being chairman of the Conservative Party down to a junior minister in the Foreign Office. Gavin Williamson out of Cabinet altogether, no longer Education Secretary. Robert Buckland out of Cabinet altogether, no longer Justice Secretary. And Robert Jenrick out of Cabinet altogether, no longer Housing Secretary. Well, while it's not over yet, yesterday seemed to go relatively smoothly. When put next to Keir Starmer's mess of a post-local election shadow cabinet reshuffle, it comparatively went without a single hitch. Sometimes these shuffles last long into the night or stretch on for days without resolution. It has to be said that yesterday was certainly something of a success for the Prime Minister, who's emerged with renewed authority, refreshed government, and having created a new data point against his anti-conflict reputation. We'll be taking an in-depth look at some of these new appointments and what they mean for the government and the future of Britain in today's Reshuffle special. Welcome to The Briefing. Now, an undisputed winner of yesterday's reshuffle was, of course, Liz Truss, darling of the Tory grassroots and a deal-maker extraordinaire. She's now ascended to a great office of state. Well, to discuss what this means for the government, I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Littlewood, who was a university contemporary of Liz Truss and is, of course, Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs, a think tank with which Liz Truss has worked closely. Welcome to the show, Mark. So, firstly, Liz Truss is someone who the Tory grassroots appear to adore. Why do you think that is?
She's a very interesting character, Tom, and I would say a conviction politician. And if you were to look at the Tory grassroots, who are overwhelmingly in favour of Brexit, I think since Boris Johnson finally got Brexit done, some of them were asking, well, what does it mean? What are the actual benefits of Brexit? And Liz Truss has had a pretty spectacular time as Trade Secretary. I don't know if you recall, Tom, the European Union and parts of the Remain campaign told us it would take typically 7 years to negotiate a trade deal with anyone. Liz Truss seems to be able to get these trade deals done in something more like 7 days. So she's actually produced some pretty handy and tidy results. One of the benefits of Brexit, or at least an opportunity of it, which we might otherwise have squandered, was to set our own trade terms with the rest of the world, and she's done that spectacularly well. She's also a very pro-enterprise politician, very in favour of free markets, sees the private sector is the thing that drives the economy, not the public sector, and that goes down pretty well, I think, with Conservative Party members too.
It's interesting that she's so popular with Conservative Party members because she wasn't always in the Conservative Party. When she was growing up, she used to be taken on CND marches with her socialist parents. At university, she was a member of the Liberals with you. What changed?
I actually think it's really, really interesting, and I think actually as it happens, Liz Truss and myself, I've known her for about 25 years, have always had very, very similar politics. Although she's in the Conservative Party, she would obviously describe herself as a Conservative, that's how she appears on every ballot paper. I think it's much better to think of her as a kind of radical, classical Liberal. I don't want to overplay the comparisons with Margaret Thatcher here, but there are definitely some. Ideologically, I would say that Liz Truss considers herself to be, a pro-freedom kind of politician, very pro-freedom really in both areas, social and economic. So to that degree, she is a bit Thatcher 2.0. I mean, it actually comes from not too far apart in the same way of the world, about 80 miles apart. Margaret Thatcher came from Grantham, Liz Truss came from Leeds. So I think she's actually been a pretty consistent, genuine Liberal in the real sense of that word. She wants government to do rather less and individual men and women and businesses to have rather more power. And the same way that Margaret Thatcher was, indeed still is, years after her death, the darling of the grassroots, that might go some way to explaining Liz Truss's popularity too.
And can we read into anything to this appointment as to how the direction of this government will go in the future? Of course, over the last year and a half, it seemed that this government has been raising taxes and taking away liberties, things that instinctively you'd think Liz Truss would be against. Does her promotion yesterday lead us to think that potentially this government may change course?
Kind of too early to tell on that one, Tom. Being a friend of Liz's, I was obviously delighted for her on a personal level. But from an economic point of view, and obviously that's what my think tank is most interested in, I wonder whether her now being in foreign policy actually removes her a little from the economic debate. The Foreign Secretary obviously has a very senior position around the cabinet table, but her role will be to talk more about threats posed by China or Russia, or what finally went on at Kabul airport and the like. It's almost a diplomatic role. So my only concern would be that as Trade Secretary, she was a little closer to the economic debate than perhaps she will be as Foreign Secretary, even though she holds one of the great offices of state. But everything I hear is that she's one of the cabinet ministers who's willing to put forward her forthright views around the cabinet table. That doesn't surprise me if true, and I don't expect that to stop.
That is a very interesting point. Although she has been promoted and herself is doing very well here, potentially her economic ideas being less pertinent now that she's no longer in an economic adjacent brief. Just finally, Liz Truss seemed to make a slight nod at the party leadership in 2019, although she didn't end up formally standing for that position. What do you think is the likelihood that this is someone who might be going for the leadership properly next time round?
I think you've got to put her in the list of names, right? I mean, there's so many permutations and variations here, Tom. We don't know when the next election will be. We don't know whether the Conservatives will win it or lose it. We don't know whether Boris Johnson will be around for another year or another 10 years. All political careers are at the mercy of the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, and Liz Truss is no different in that regard. But I would expect now that when people speculate in the coffee bars and the pubs in these sort of parts about who the next leader of the Conservative Party, the next Prime Minister might be, there's no doubt whatsoever that her name is in the frame. She's probably one of 4 or 5 people that you could see being the next Conservative Prime Minister. And I think her now being Foreign Secretary, she's done cabinet jobs before, Justice Secretary, this rather new role of Trade Secretary, but now an incredibly prestigious, very important, one of the senior roles of state. I think you've got to consider her as a possible candidate to be Prime Minister at some point in the future. But, you know, long way to go yet. Millions of things could intervene. She's going to have to do this job as well as she did the Trade Secretary job. Quite a challenge, but she's got to be one of the names in the frame, no doubt about it.
Well, what an interesting career to watch, and no doubt we will be in the weeks and months ahead. Mark Littlewood, Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs, thank you very much for joining us on the briefing this morning on GB News. Now, Liz Truss is not the only state-educated, no-nonsense, free-market, female slayer of political correctness, widely considered to have been a winner yesterday. Priti Patel fits all of those descriptions too, as does the surprise appointment of the day, new Culture Secretary Nadine Dorries. Liverpool-born, Nadine grew up on a council estate. She practised as a nurse before being elected to Parliament in 2005, representing Mid Bedfordshire. Potentially best of all, she's totally unafraid to speak her mind. Her straight-talking Twitter feed is a goldmine. Whilst much of the activist left have been playing offence archaeology, much of the right has been thoroughly enjoying what they have been outraged by. Here's what she had to say about the bane of Westminster, professional prat-in-a-hat, Mr. Stop Brexit Steve himself. I love being identified and shouted at across Parliament Square by Steve when I'm a sitting duck in the back of my stationary car stuck in traffic. That's not a security risk at all. Nope, not one little bit. Hello, Met police officers stuck next to him. Well, this is a culture secretary who does really seem to care about culture, though I'm not sure that she does in the same way that some creative industries might expect. Here's her take on the culture wars. Left-wing snowflakes are kidding comedy, tearing down historic statues, removing books from universities, dumbing down panto, removing Christ from Christmas and suppressing free speech. Sadly, it must be true, history does repeat itself. It will be music next. Well, that's her view of culture. I'm not sure that many of the creative industries will be particularly keen on that appointment, although potentially many in the Conservative Party will. And finally, of course, the DCMS has a key role to play when it comes to the BBC. Shall we have a look at a flavour of her thoughts about that organisation? Is anyone surprised that the BBC have shortlisted the assassination of Margaret Thatcher for an award? I really hope that Nadine doesn't stop tweeting. Look at this. This is absolutely cracking stuff. Not only does she go after Stop Brexit Steve, maybe finally the government will do something about him, she also defends the sort of culture war angle that has been potentially lacking from government and even has a pop at the BBC. But more than this, of course, Nadine is a best-selling author. She's also been a bit of a star of the silver screen herself, appearing on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here in 2012. Well, when was the last time a best-selling creative was in the reins at the Department of Digital, Culture, Media and Sport? Perhaps the best thing about this inspired appointment is just how many of Britain's most irritating holier-than-thou commentators are put out by it. We have a culture secretary ready to defend culture who's unafraid to speak her mind. Bring it on. Well, moving on to another appointment today, Michael Gove is a reformer. From education to the environment to his no-deal planning responsibilities at the Cabinet Office, wherever he goes, things get done. Many are seeing his move to a souped-up housing ministry with added responsibility for the union and levelling up. They think that this shows that the government is committed to getting planning reform done. Well, joining me in the studio is John Myers, the founder of YIMBY Alliance. Yes, that's YIMBY, not NIMBY. Yes, in my backyard. It's an increasingly influential campaign group working across the UK to end the housing crisis. John, welcome to the show. So, Michael Gove is someone with a weighty reputation in government. Where he's been before, whether it's education, environment, or indeed no-deal planning at the Cabinet Office, he's been put in place to make sure that something gets done. Are you hopeful now that housing reform is properly on this government's agenda?
Well, there's no doubt that Michael Gove understands that we have a crazy shortage of housing in this country, that young people are getting a terrible deal, and that we haven't built enough homes for 70 years. And that's one of the reasons why people in this country earn less than the US or Germany. He understands we need to build more homes. But, you know, we've seen him dancing in an Edinburgh nightclub. He's going to need his best dance moves to fix housing, because this is probably the most difficult job he's had.
We've seen that housing reform has been attempted a number of times over the last decade by successive governments, and it just hasn't materialised. The vested interests here are incredibly strong. What does he need to do to take them on?
Well, I think he was housing spokesman 15 years ago, and his instincts then are very much in tune with what the government's just done in terms of its change of position. He said he didn't like sticks, he preferred carrots, he didn't like central planning, central targets, and that he wanted to give more people more power to build where they wanted to, where it was appropriate. And that's very much in line with what the government's just said in its big move on housing over the last week. So I think there are ways to go forward on that. His predecessor got some very bad advice. It led to a rebellion of 100 Tory MPs. And there are ways forward that those MPs support, that the government's now moving towards, that we've been pushing for some years now, where you give local people more power to get the benefits of more housing, and that way it's a win-win answer.
And this is talking about street votes, this idea that was put forward in a presentation bill on Monday and seemed to have been taken on by the government. Are we hearing that this is going to continue to be taken on by the government? Because, of course, everyone was sort of celebrating on Wednesday that Robert Jenrick had taken this on, but unfortunately Robert Jenrick, someone who has supported housing reform, although potentially not has been that successful at it, no longer in post there. Is this something the government will continue with?
I hope so. I think it's very much in line with what Michael Gove believes. And just to be clear, the idea is that we would let residents on the street agree amongst themselves, vote for what additional extensions they would allow, what designs they would allow on their streets. There are lots of families living in tight spaces. They'd like more room. They're grumpy because the council won't let them build an extension. If we're just talking about changes that only really affect the other people on that street, why shouldn't those people get to decide for themselves? People, as Michael Gove said, people have had enough of experts, and people are sick of Whitehall telling them what to do.
I think I should always step in when people use that enough of experts quote, because it's like that Peter Mandelson quote where he said, I'm perfectly comfortable with people getting filthy rich. There's a second part to the quote, which is as long as they pay their taxes in the Mandelson frame, but also in the Gove frame, it's of organisations with acronyms saying they know what's best and getting it consistently wrong. Apologies for that. But sticking back to housing, why did Robert Jenrick not succeed?
It's a very difficult job. I mean, it goes further back than the 10 years you mentioned. For 70 years, we've failed to reform the planning system to get enough housing. And I think the advice he was given wasn't great. They went down a path which was always going to be incredibly difficult. Probably the launch could have been more elegantly done, and they've ended up in, I think, a much more sensible position now. It's still going to evolve, but they're going in the way of carrots, not sticks. They're going in the way of letting people work out ways forward that suit them and also add more housing, and I think that's a much more promising path.
Because really the number of houses being built has been far too low for a considerable amount of time now, and since about the year 2000, growth in average wages has been a lot slower than growth in house prices. This has some electoral consequences, does it not?
It's bad for the Conservative Party, there's no doubt about that. I mean, there are a lot of very dissatisfied young people. They're renting, they can't afford to buy. The proportion of home ownership among the under 30s has plummeted over the last 20 years. It used to be commonplace that at 25 you could easily buy a house. Much harder now, especially in expensive places like the southeast. And Michael Gove understands that because his constituency is obviously Surrey. So I think we are going to make some progress here, so long as he sticks to his principles and he's clever about the way he does it.
Now, one of the things that people have been bringing up over the last 24 hours is that this constituency, Surrey Heath, Michael Gove represents it, has done since 2005. It's a wealthy area, it's in the southeast, probably has a lot of NIMBY constituents and, of course, is Lib Dem facing, and the Liberal Democrats are traditionally huge campaigners against new housing. Will this play into the calculations here? Yeah,
absolutely, no doubt. And I'm sure that's what fed into his earlier statements about not liking central imposition of housing. But he's open-minded on things like Greenfield, as is CPRE, for example. The CPRE will point to places like South Walton and Devon, where they actually allowed more housing. The villagers decided to allow more housing in an area of outstanding natural beauty. So if you get the carrots the right way, if you let local people find the incentives to do it for themselves, you can get progress here.
Now, a lot of people will hear about houses on green fields and instinctively think, yikes, that does not sound like something that is good. How do you present that in a way that actually can win support?
I think, look, they're very clearly, if if you talk to people, they worry about losing control, and they worry that new housing just isn't going to bring any benefits for their community. Now, in the most expensive areas of the country, there's so much uplift, there's so much benefit to spread around by building new housing, that if some of that goes to the community, it's much easier to get them on the side. People care about whether they're going to win from this or whether it's just going to bring them inconvenience. We have to be more clever about the way that we've been doing it, because we've been failing for 70 years. It's just been things imposed by Whitehall.
And so moving away from Whitehall imposition, something that Michael Gove has done arguably in his education reforms, giving more powers to head teachers, arguably in his time at the Cabinet Office, trying to maybe not move things away from Whitehall, but certainly from Brussels. This seems to be a thread in that way.
I think that's right. I mean, you're the political expert, Tom, not me, but he definitely, reading what he's said before in a range, and done before in a range of different fields, I think he's got the mindset to be smart about this and to find a way forward that people can be happy with.
So if you were to give a likelihood for comprehensive planning reform, the way in which Boris described this last year, I think it was, the largest sort of planning reform since 1948, is this genuinely now on the agenda?
I think the government still has its commitment to address this problem. I'm much more confident than I was 3 months ago that they're really going to make progress and that they're going to get plentiful more housing built to help young people, to help the other people who are very unhappy with where they are right now.
And one piece of advice for Michael Gove?
I think listen to a range of people, keep an open mind and learn from the mistakes of his 25 predecessors.
Well, John Myers, thank you very much for joining me on The Briefing this morning.
Thank you.
Cheers. Well, we'll be going to a short break now, but after that we'll be discussing more about the reshuffle. Stick with us. Welcome back to The Briefing. Now, few tipped Nadeem Zwahi to be appointed to the education brief yesterday. The successful businessman turned politician has won plaudits for his role as vaccine minister, overseeing much of the UK's initially world-beating rollout. Well, Jonathan Gullis is a Conservative MP who serves on the Education Select Committee and also used to serve as a councillor in Nadeem Zwahi's constituency. So who better to talk about this appointment? Welcome to the show, Jonathan. Firstly, I want to talk on a personal level about Nadeem. He's someone you've known for a long time, and he came to this country aged 8 or 9 without being able to speak a word of English and is now Education Secretary. Can you talk about that journey a little bit?
I think what it shows is one of the great British stories of this country. At the end of the day, there are many examples. We have the Home Secretary as well. But Nadeem, like you say, coming into this country as a refugee, not being able to speak the language, has worked incredibly hard to achieve all that he's achieved, setting up one of the most successful research companies in the world in YouGov, and now obviously having successfully rolled out a vaccine programme across our United Kingdom, and rightfully now at the top table. And I look forward to working with him as Secretary of State for Education.
With the previous Secretary of State for Education. As a member of the Select Committee for Education, you'll have questioned him on a number of occasions and seen the work he's done. What do you think will now change that there's a new person at the top of that department?
Well, I think you saw that Nadeem used to be in the Department for Education and as Minister for Children and Families, as well as being the apprenticeship czar. So he already has a good understanding of the brief, a good understanding of the department. And what I'm really looking forward to seeing is Nadeem inject the very best of the business world into education, because ultimately for further education, higher education, having that business link is going to be so important, making sure that people can go in both their apprenticeship and degree level, and obviously in places like Stoke, where people aren't taking up level 3 and 4 qualifications, that we're levelling up and giving them the opportunity, and the lifetime skills guarantee is something to build upon. But if you look at Nadeem's record, one of the most successful things I think he did in the Department for Education was looking for children in care, working with some of the top private boarding schools in this country and giving those children in care the opportunity to go and board at these top schools so that they can have the very best start in life. And those are children, let's be honest, who need it and deserve it the most. And I think that's only a testament of a small part of a big journey he's about to go on.
There's a huge, huge task at education now. We've seen how much the education of children has been disrupted and damaged over the last year and a half. Many people have been suggesting that more money needs to go into education now. Is there anything that leadership alone or policy changes can do to help children catch up?
I think the key thing is that we have a very successful national tutoring programme that is ultimately going to keep rolling out and making sure that it does get to those kids who deserve it most, like we see in Stoke-on-Trent. We have given head teachers a significant amount of funding to invest in, whether that be giving teachers that are currently on their payroll additional hours, or obviously bringing in maybe specialists in their local area or university students even. So there has already been a significant amount of money going into catch-up. The best thing you can do is making sure that we keep kids in school, and ultimately that is what Nadeem's job is going to be throughout the winter, is to ensure that children are in school getting the best face-to-face education they can get from their teachers. And obviously I'm a huge fan of academisation. I'm a big fan of the free school programme. That has brought about huge success, these Govian and Gibbian reforms, and I have no doubt that Nadeem will want to carry on in that same vein.
Well, Jonathan Gullis, thank you very much for joining us on The Briefing this morning. A fascinating look into Nadeem as a person and education policy in general. Well, catch me again tomorrow on The Briefing. For now, it's back to The Point with Mercy Muroki and Patrick Christys.